So we're going to go through by macronutrients first, as each pertains to health and performance. You guys with me? Any questions so far? All right, let's go. So first, we're going to talk about protein. Probably the most nuanced macronutrient from both these perspectives that we can talk about in relation to performance and health. So we'll just make our two categories: performance, health. First concept I need to run by you guys is called PDCAAS. So it's protein digestibility amino acid corrected score, which is a mouthful, but ultimately this is an equation-derived number, okay, that basically tells you how useful the protein is within a human. Okay, they basically take 1 gram of the protein in question and compare it to 1 gram of a reference protein. And there's a limiting essential amino acid, and as soon as that runs out, all right, as defined by its availability in the human colon, basically you get a numerical value. So the higher the value, the better. There are, like whey protein, for instance, would have a PDCAAS value of greater than 100, but when they came up with this back in the 30s, they said, anything over 100, no use to going over 100, so we're just going to stop it. So whey protein, for instance, has a value that if you calculate it out would be greater than 100. And the only thing you need to know is that a PDCAAS value of 100 means that it's super, super useful. It's highly bioavailable. It's very rich in essential amino acids. Compared to a protein like a protein from wheat, for instance, has a very low PDCAAS. It's in the 30s, so it's less bioavailable. It has less essential amino acids. You guys with me so far? Yeah. Okay. So from a performance standpoint, the idea would be every time that you eat, the meal contains a lot of essential amino acids, all right? And the idea is every time that you feed, you want to generate a muscle protein synthesis response, okay? The muscle protein synthesis is effectively your muscles generating more muscle protein, all right? So muscles are made of protein. Every time you have a muscle protein synthesis event, the idea is that you're either repairing, remodeling, or building new tissue, okay? So from a hypertrophy standpoint, muscle size, you would want a lot of muscle protein synthesis. You with me? From a high training load standpoint, you would want a lot of muscle protein synthesis, all right? This is counterbalanced by muscle protein breakdown. This is the breakdown of your muscle tissue. If you have more muscle protein breakdown than muscle protein synthesis, you're losing muscle protein. It's atrophy. If you have a net positive muscle protein synthesis compared to muscle protein breakdown, that means you're accruing new muscle. Okay? You guys with me so far? All right. So, in an athlete who is chasing performance, if a meal does not generate a muscle protein synthesis response based on its PDCAAS, it's a low quality protein, or it doesn't have enough protein per meal, it is a waste of a meal, all right, from a recovery standpoint, all right? So if you have a meal that is only carbs, only fats, or has a terrible source of protein and doesn't have a lot of essential amino acids, it doesn't mean that the calories aren't going to be used for recovery in some way. It's just not going to be used at the level of the muscle to build or remodel muscle, okay? From a health standpoint, muscle protein synthesis is needed so that you don't lose a lot of muscle protein per day, all right? Conditions where the turnover of muscle protein are elevated: 1, burns; 2, post-surgery; 3, illness; 4, protein-losing diseases, which there are a number, HIV and AIDS, for instance, or other muscle wasting, okay? Those instances, you would want a higher protein diet so that you can generate more muscle protein synthesis so you don't lose a lot of muscle tissue, okay? There's multiple studies that you can look at for inpatients, so people who are hospitalized, when they lose a lot of muscle size and muscle cross-sectional area in the hospital, that they do worse. The mortality goes up, okay? It's bad news. So again, you want to stay jacked if you're in the hospital. You need to make sure that your doc's writing for the double protein diet, okay? You guys laugh, haha, we need more protein. It's true though, this is not necessarily something that we're just making up on the fly here. All right. Other things to know about the muscle protein synthesis. So our requirements in general for muscle protein synthesis: high amounts of essential amino acids. Most popular and the most necessary is going to be leucine. All right? Leucine is one of the 3 branched chain amino acids. There's leucine, valine, isoleucine. Leucine is the powerhouse. What I mean by that is when leucine is elevated in a single meal, it effectively stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And in its absence in a meal, muscle protein synthesis will not go. All right? So its brother and sister in crime are isoleucine and valine. They're needed for the metabolism of leucine, but without leucine in the mix, kind of screwed. Okay? So it is possible to eat a meal that's devoid of leucine, all right? And it has a bunch of calories in it and even a bunch of protein. But if the protein doesn't have a good leucine source, the overall response to that meal is not to generate a muscle protein synthesis response. Okay? That doesn't mean there won't be any muscle protein synthesis, just that it's not to the magnitude that we would otherwise like. All right? I view a muscle protein synthesis kind of like it's a threshold event, meaning once you get enough amino acids, essential amino acids into the bloodstream, muscle protein synthesis occurs almost to a maximum. And that giving more essential amino acids doesn't necessarily make this go much higher, right? So it's almost an all or nothing response. If you get a muscle protein synthesis response to go in general, you're getting about 80% of the max that you could ever get. And a little more essential amino acids will drive it up to 100, but that's still a small gap. Versus if you never hit this threshold, it doesn't go, right? So if you're like, I only like rice protein, that's all I like, and it doesn't have a lot of leucine, and its PDCAAS is lower, its bioavailability is lower, and you never cross that threshold, no muscle protein synthesis occurs. Sir?
How do isolated BCAAs play into that?
This is a great question. It's a hot topic now. People are talking about BCAAs everywhere, right? There are, on the one extreme, you have people who say BCAAs are crap. It's expensive flavored water. On the other hand, people say you need to take BCAAs, every few hours to keep up your muscle protein synthesis rates. So let's talk about this from a handful of different perspectives. Perspective number 1. Is it useful to generate a muscle protein synthesis event as frequently as possible over a given day? We don't know. My inkling is that it's not when we consider long-term outcomes. And so what I mean by that is if you're considering hypertrophy or muscle strength, all right, and you're comparing generating a good muscle protein synthesis response 3 times a day versus 5 times a day, I think at the end of a year, you have no difference in outcomes. All right? If it's 1 versus 5, I think that's a more interesting situation, but we haven't studied that. We don't know. So I think from a pure muscle protein synthesis stimulus for BCAAs, free-form BCAAs, in the context of a protein-rich diet, I think it's probably a loser. All right? I don't think BCAAs are useful there. I think if you have a low-protein diet and you need extra BCAAs in each meal to get that muscle protein synthesis response, these would be chronic kidney disease patients who are eating a low-protein diet, or people who have certain amino acid transport disorders who can't handle protein-rich diets. BCAAs become super invaluable then. There are other data showing that BCAAs can be helpful from a recovery and performance standpoint, but as I'll allude to earlier when I talk about, or later rather, when I talk about the central governor model of fatigue, performance is multifactorial. So it'd be very difficult for me to say that BCAAs improve performance. Bottom line, I tell my athletes who are competing multiple times per day training multiple times per day to do BCAAs regularly around their training, but I have not recommended that people take BCAAs between meals any longer. Oh yeah, so the question is, are BCAAs supplemented equivalent to like a protein supplement? And my response is no, because you're lacking the other 6 essential amino acids. And those are rate limiting. So effectively, once you run out of essential amino acids in the bloodstream, it doesn't matter how high your leucine levels are. An interesting argument that has come up from BCAA sort of haters. So they're like, yeah, well, there was an opinion paper that recently got published. It was by Robert W. Wolf with an E, and he says that BCAAs may actually decrease muscle protein synthesis. And And there's 2 studies that he's using where they infused BCAAs over, one was a 3-hour period and one was a 12-hour period. And you show a refractory period if you have a constant infusion of BCAAs. And I don't think you can derive anything from those type of studies except for you shouldn't constantly feed, which we know to be the case. So in the ICU, a guy at my old medical school, Dr. Merrick, effectively made the argument that we should not be doing continuous feedings anymore on patients, because if you continuously feed them, they can't generate a muscle protein synthesis response unless you stop feeding them for a period of 3 hours. So there's that. They get more insulin resistant. They get more fat deposition in their muscle tissue. Ultimately, bad things happen to them. So I think all you can derive from that study is say, well, you shouldn't be constantly sipping on a jug full of amino acids. It's another nail in the coffin for carrying around a gallon of water. Nobody has a gallon, we're safe. Yeah.
What about for patients with PKU?
Yeah, so the phenylketonuria, yeah. So if there's an amino acid, either metabolism or transport disorder, BCAAs may be super useful, or even isolated leucine by itself. Yeah. But what I alluded to when we were discussing that study of chronic feedings was that in order to generate a muscle protein synthesis response, there needs to be a period of feeding followed by a period of fasting, right? And in general, in humans, we found this to be 3 to 5 hours. Effectively, if you have a meal that is sufficient to drive a muscle protein synthesis response, that you need to wait 3 hours to eat again, otherwise no additional muscle protein synthesis response can be had. So what does that mean? If you have a meal and then 2 hours later you eat, it doesn't mean that you're not going to use those calories and you're going to have explosive diarrhea because your body just doesn't know what to do. That's not what happens. It's just that none of that protein is going to actively contribute to muscle protein synthesis. Rather, it's going to be either oxidized as fuel or keep circling around until it enters into the Krebs cycle to make pyruvate and then later glucose, all right? Or maybe through a series of very, very inefficient steps, it may become fat on some level, okay?
So what's the required grams?
Man, that's great. You set me up. So how much protein, since we're still on protein, do you need in a meal to generate a muscle protein synthesis response? And ultimately, that ties back to the PDCAAS. So we'll just call this bioavailability, even though those are 2 different terms. And how much leucine is in that source. So in general, about a 3-gram leucine content covers all comers. What I mean by all comers, I mean all demographics. So this is our young person who's super sensitive to amino acids because their hormonal milieu, their testosterone levels, their insulin sensitivity, they're super sensitive. All right, and it also covers our geezers who have lower testosterone or are less sensitive to amino acids. And I don't mean to imply that testosterone levels are the only sort of, it's not the only way that amino acid sensitivity is sort of regulated. It's just one of them. Other things include blood flow and actual absorption of protein and stuff like that, which we'll actually talk about when we talk about anabolic resistance. But this is sort of the dose that's selected to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Leucine doses above this have been shown to not create additional muscle protein synthesis. This threshold is actually right around like 2.2, 2.5 grams, something like that. So if you get 3, you've given yourself a little extra, and it goes up to 100.
So then all you need to do is hit that 3 grams, and that'll determine the gram of protein.
Correct. So depending on your protein source. So this ends up being, in real protein sources, this ends up being somewhere between 20 to 25 grams of protein, all right, in general. So as long as it's an animal-derived protein source, which by definition and in general, because it's from an animal, have high leucine sources. Ribeye, whey protein, for instance. Why is whey so effective? Because of its leucine content, okay? That's why whey is the king of protein. It has such a high leucine content, its bioavailability is super high and it's cheap, right? So per calorie, you'd be hard-pressed to find another protein source that has as much leucine as whey protein, for instance, okay? So for instance, rice protein, people are like, oh, rice protein, super clean. There's a company that's very famous, particularly in the sport of fitness, who makes a rice protein. In the equivalence studies, 20 grams of whey is equivalent to 40 grams of rice protein. And you're like, oh, see? So the study headline reads, rice protein equivalent to whey. Yeah, but only when you double the dose, and therefore double the calories, right? Which may be an important consideration for somebody on a calorie-restricted diet or who's on a budget. Because guess what? That rice protein is also more expensive.
So why do you think that 3 grams is appropriate for all comers when, say, you have someone my size compared to someone like Laurel's size, where I'm literally double her body weight?
Sure.
And that doesn't seem to apply to like the other biological functions. Like you're showing me medication, I might need a bigger dose.
Correct.
What's your opinion on why leucine is that?
Yeah, so if I had to guess, the cellular functions that leucine control are effectively systemic, meaning they're body-wide in response to a minimum threshold being met. And I don't think that has to do with like body surface area. Yeah, so that's what I would have to guess. So leucine's super insulinogenic, insulin goes up. This is part of the muscle protein synthesis response, all right? And that happens body-wide regardless of dose. So that's the way I understand it to work.
The studies you feel that they've done have been done on hard training, large athletes, and you feel they're pretty good?
Yeah. So depending on who you read and how you interpret the data, you could make an argument that protein dosing, you could start at 0.8 grams per pound and go to like 1.2. And you'll find stuff that says, oh, it should be 1 gram per kilo, which is less than this, all the way up to 1.8 grams per kilo. I think you're seeing a methodology sort of error or heterogeneity, meaning that the studies are different. They're talking about different things. So think about the protein per meal. So when somebody sees this, they say, oh, Jordan, you're saying I only need 20 grams of protein per meal. If I eat 5 times a day, guess what? That's only 100 grams of protein. It's like, yeah, well, you're not taking into consideration the protein from your carbohydrate and fat sources, which, depending on your caloric needs, may make up a significant portion of your protein. So let's say you need 3,000 calories a day. Let's just say. We know that from animal sources, you may only need 100 grams of protein from animal. But the rest of your calories may come from rice and oats and potatoes and whatever that are going to have trace proteins in them. And so your total protein intake may actually be closer to 200. And you weigh 200 pounds, so that's a gram per pound. And the internet now explodes because they're so pissed. Like, oh my gosh, you're telling people to have a 1 gram per pound. That's so outdated. Well, I don't think so. You just need to look at the actual evidence. In the evidence, they're not doing these, full-on, like, I'm going to account for every gram of protein that you've taken in, including trace proteins, all right? Further, that there would need to be some risk with a slightly higher protein intake, all right? What are the risks of a high protein diet? So the risk, right, which is a very inefficient process, turning to fat. Here are the real risks. Real risks is from an economical standpoint. The most expensive calorie is protein. All right, so price. 2, protein's very satiating, and so it'd be very difficult to eat a bunch of carbs and fat if you're eating a ton of protein. If you said, I'm eating 400 grams of protein a day, I said, wow, how do you get your carbs and fats in? You're probably not very hungry, or so somebody who's having a tough time eating as much calories, you need to make sure that they're not doing something like eating 300 grams of protein per day. All right. The other thing is, imagine if you are taking in 400 grams of protein a day. Okay, you're just committed. All right. Yeah, A for effort, all right? So all this protein, right? Since your body can only use a certain amount of that to contribute to muscle protein synthesis at one given time, the rest of it is going to be either oxidized, which means burnt, or cycled around into different ways to be stored, and that's very inefficient unless it's glycogen. So your body's going to get really good at burning protein. The enzymes responsible for oxidizing protein get upregulated. Now you go on vacation. You're in Cabo. You're having 50 grams of protein a day, ton of alcohol, okay? And your body's still really good at burning protein, all right? So you may enter some sort of this hyper-catabolic state. Maybe. I haven't seen data on that. This is just how I think about this when I think about what are the potential risks for eating a super, super high protein diet, all right?
So you don't necessarily start losing your body from your muscle immediately.
Nope.
It have to be like maybe.
Yeah, extended periods of time. Yep. All right. So we're looking at getting a good 3-gram dose of leucine each meal, and meals are spread 3 to 5 hours apart. All right. And from a performance standpoint, you could make an argument that the frequency would change based on your training. right? Because you want to fuel training appropriately, right? If you find that you perform best with a meal 90 minutes prior to eating or prior to training, then you might be more closer to 5 meals a day. Whereas for health, the number one thing that matters is going to be compliance, right? So it is still 3 to 5 hours, but the main thing you're looking for here is how well can my client or how well can I comply to the diet? So if you like big meals, and that's really what would keep you on the straight and narrow, then maybe you only have 3 meals a day that are larger in size. Or if you like to eat very frequently, maybe 5 meals is better. But since we're not talking about this from a performance standpoint, more of just a health standpoint, then whatever your goal is related, you either need to weight management, or weight loss, or weight gain. If you're underweight, the whole thing is going to be about compliance, all right? But the dosing of leucine per meal is going to be the same. So approximately 3 grams. Somebody on the internet, and this goes on the tubes, they're going to say, it's actually 2.6. Like, well, each age range is going to have its own sort of minimum threshold for leucine. And in general, 3 grams is going to catch even the oldest person and the youngest person that we're going to see, all right? There's a reason why that's what I put in my protein. And I'm not necessarily trying to sell you guys on my protein.
That's what I thought you were doing.
Well, that's later. Yeah. But it is for you to check out your own label on your protein, right? So if you go look at your whey protein or whatever protein you have and you see a leucine content that's in the hundreds of milligrams, okay, not grams, milligrams, you're like, this is probably junk. So elemental whey, getting it from the one of maybe close to 10 manufacturers in the world, will have anywhere between 2,100 milligrams to 2,600. Right? That's the general range for a serving of protein from the manufacturer, right? Until it gets to the labeler or the supplement company who you're buying it from. So there is another very popular supplement brand in the sport of fitness who is selling a 1 pound protein supplement for $58, okay? That has, I'm not joking you, less than 200 milligrams of leucine per serving. 200 milligrams, right? You'd need more than 10 times that dose to get here. You'd have to take the whole container and all those calories just to get to that leucine threshold. And so you have to ask yourself, is this a marketing, is this just a marketing, experiment where they're going to say, hey, let's see how dumb these people are. See if they buy our stuff if we put enough booty shorts in front of it, all right? Or did they just not ask a scientist? Because the money that they're spending on advertising is in the 6-figure range, and they couldn't have paid a graduate student, a couple $100 to say, hey, what should we do with our protein based on the evidence? Because scientists are cheap, right? Professional athletes are expensive. They couldn't hire a scientist for a few hours of their time, which really upsets me if you haven't been able to tell. All right? Yes, sir.
On the fasting part.
Yeah.
So you eat enough, the right amount of
Yep.
leucine,
Yes, sir.
and then you eat again 2 hours later.
Yeah.
Does this completely kill the MPS or?
So the second dose is not going to trigger another muscle protein synthesis event until you've waited an additional 3 hours after the second meal. So effectively, the amino acids in the bloodstream are still elevated. The original muscle protein synthesis event is still going on, albeit at a lower level. Usually peaks about 90 minutes after eating and kind of trails off from there. But the influx of new amino acids don't trigger another muscle protein synthesis response until enough time has passed. It's called a refractory period. So you basically need that 3-hour sort of window between meals, which is why eating like 6 or 7 times a day is kind of bad advice.
So for reasons of just to be sociable,
Sure.
you have this second meal. That's not a problem. It just adds some calories that will get used to get.
Correct.
To get burned.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
I just want to make sure that you just didn't waste the first meal
Oh, no.
MPS-wise.
No, you good. The refractory period? Yeah, so basically we think of it as the amino acids need to drop back down to baseline. And so the whole pathway is the mTOR AMP3P kinase pathway, and that needs to effectively reset. So effectively, you are anabolically resistant between meals. And so I don't know if this is a clearance of substrate or if this is insulin dependent. It does appear that that whole pathway needs to be reset, however.
Are you better off limiting the number of meals?
Yeah. Well, it depends on how much you're.
If you're trying to get like 100 grams a day, you want 3 meals instead of 7 grams.
Yeah, so the question is if you're better off limiting the number of meals. It depends, because if you're already eating 3 or 4 meals a day, then I would keep the frequency the same. If someone told you that you were supposed to eat 8 meals per day, well, you need to get your money back, and then you need to decrease your meal frequency for optimal sort of outcomes, right? If eating 8 times per day keeps you in a caloric deficit, then I think initially that's okay, except for, even from a health perspective, I know that that level of meal frequency has been associated with increased levels of insulin resistance because you've never effectively allowed this fasting period to occur. And in fact, some of the data on the intermittent fasting has been very elucidating with this. If you don't have periods of fasting in between meals, you don't sort of get this insulin resensitization for meals, which is ultimately one of the things that we want. Also, you guys have heard a lot about human growth hormone, right? Growth hormone. So growth hormone is an energy status hormone. So when does growth hormone go up? When you exercise and when you're fasting, right? So when you're training, the glycogen levels in your muscles drop. Human growth hormone goes up, signaling, hey, we need energy. When you're fasting, human growth hormone levels go up because you're depleting your glycogen stores in your liver. So growth hormone goes up. None of these are anabolic stimuli as far as actual muscle growth goes, but they're actually regulators of energy. And it's associated with some other positive benefits, and you want that to occur between meals. So I wouldn't fast after a workout in order to keep my growth hormone levels high. I don't think that's a good strategy, but I think if you're not having enough time between meals where growth hormone is allowed to elevate, then you're effectively eating too frequently. It's nothing I would test for. I would just say that eating with 3 to 5 hours between meals is probably best.
Are all animal products similar in their listing content, or are they like vegetable?
Yeah, so the question is animal protein sources, are they all created equal from an essential amino acid? So they're not all equal like directly across the board, but they're comparable, certainly, yeah. The real problem is when you start getting to plant-based proteins or when you're talking about protein supplements. So like a beef isolate is not comparable to a whey isolate. Egg supplement is not comparable to a whey supplement. So that's when it starts to get really kind of funky. But effectively at that time, you've introduced a processing feature that has sort of concentrated the good stuff in the whey, and everybody else is just trying to catch up, right? Okay, so we gotta keep going. Anabolic resistance is the next thing we're talking about under protein. Anabolic resistance is a phenomenon that we've recently discovered that older people, less male people, and less trained people require a higher dose of protein to get the same effect as their younger, more male, more trained cohorts, okay? So I'll say this again, the more male you are, the less vegan you are, and the more trained you are, the more sensitive you are to the effects of amino acids, okay? This is due to a handful of factors. Factor number 1 is blood flow. Blood flow, as we age, gets worse, okay? So delivering that high level of amino acids that you just ate to the muscle is compromised. And this is actually reversed in studies when they look at medications like nitroprusside or lisinopril. These are both antihypertensives, nitroprusside being a very, very strong one. Basically, it increases blood flow to the level of the muscle. That corrects for that anabolic resistance, okay? Another mechanism is going to be protein absorption from the gut. As we age, protein absorption from the gut gets worse, okay? And as your protein source gets more and more vegan, all right, the worse it gets as far as an absorption standpoint. So again, and this all goes into that sort of catch-all term we're going to use is bioavailability, right? So why is whey way better than your vegan source of protein? Well, one, it's got more essential amino acids. 2, it's better absorbed, right? And 3, it makes amino acids go through the roof in your bloodstream a lot faster than a vegan source of protein, all right? Other thing is the hormonal milieu, so testosterone levels. all right? Higher your testosterone levels are, the more sensitive you are to amino acids. So again, the more male you are, or the younger you are in general, the more testosterone you have floating around. This makes you more and more sensitive to amino acids. All right. The final thing is insulin sensitivity. Again, the older we get, the more insulin resistant we tend to trend towards, and that's due to, again, accumulating fat mass, decreased muscle mass, and aging in general. So you would like to be young, with male, and an omnivore, all right, and well-trained. So training can overcome some of these things. So when you train, you get more amino acid sensitive. All right. It's been shown that even as short a duration as a 10-minute walk makes elderly people more responsive to amino acids. Okay. And so the test that they were running was 20 grams of whey compared to 40 grams of whey, and did it cause a muscle protein synthesis response? And initially, with no pre-protein walk, the 20 grams did nil. But 40 grams overcame the resistance. Then they had the older people to go for a 10-minute walk, and after the 10-minute walk, they responded to the 20 grams. So that sort of mechanical action, mechanical function increases the sensitivity to amino acids, and you get a muscle protein synthesis response. So being active and being training in general makes you more amino acid sensitive. And in younger patients, if you put them on bed rest for 10 days, they get amino acid resistant. All right, which is ultimately corrected by becoming more active again. So if you think about an older person, right, sarcopenia or muscle loss is a big problem. If they go through periods in their life where they're inactive, becoming even more resistant to amino acids, they're losing a bunch of muscle mass, and then they're active, but they're not eating a high protein diet, or the protein quality is low, all right, and that keeps cycling. They end up losing a bunch of muscle mass, they lose a bunch of function, and then they can't function independently. That's bad. You guys agree? Yeah. So anabolic resistance is something to consider if you're older, if you're female, or if you're vegan, right? You'll just have to either double the dose if you're vegan, you'll have to exercise a little bit more efficiently if you're older, and if you're female, you also may need a slightly higher dose per per pound of body weight of protein, or use a really efficient protein source, okay? Last thing I'll talk about protein is whey compared to casein. Actually, we'll wait for the supplements. We'll go there. We'll go there later. Any questions on this portion about protein? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Let the record show there were no questions. All right, we're going to go to carbohydrates next. Carbs. Some of my best friends are carbs, and I'm excited to talk about them. First thing we'll talk about is glycemic index and glycemic load. All right? Glycemic index, we alluded to this earlier. It is the area under the curve of it's blood glucose measured over 2 hours after a exposure to 50 grams of a carbohydrate source. Now you have to be fasting 12 hours prior to that, and then someone gives you 50 grams of carbohydrates from like white bread, and they look at what your blood sugar does for 2 hours, and that's your glycemic index, and it's compared to pure sugar. So white bread is about 100, meaning that it and pure sugar do about the same thing in response to blood sugar. Okay? If you add fiber to that, and so now it's whole grain bread, all right, the glycemic index goes down. Why? Because fiber makes sugar appearance in the blood much slower, right? So over that 2 hours when you're measuring blood sugar, it doesn't go up as high, and it certainly doesn't go up as fast, all right? Glycemic load is a derivative of glycemic index in that you take the glycemic index and you multiply it by the typical dose that people eat at a meal. So again, we talked about bananas earlier. Medium banana, I believe, has 23 grams of carbohydrates in it. And so while it has a high glycemic index, the glycemic load is actually pretty low because 23 grams of carbs is nothing. All right? So that's kind of why. So the question isn't necessarily what is glycemic index, what is glycemic load. You guys can all, Wikipedia that and look it up. The question is, why I'm here is that useful for weight loss, all right, from a health standpoint? Or if you had to make weight for a meet or for a competition, is it useful for weight loss? And what I mean by that, is it useful for losing weight or maintaining weight loss compared to an equally calorie deficit diet, an equal deficit in calories? So if you have two people eating, 500 calories under maintenance, does one that's low glycemic index do better than one that's not, right? And we don't have evidence to say that that's true. suggesting that perhaps glycemic index and glycemic load in and of themselves are unimportant. However, people who try to adopt a low glycemic index diet do better with weight loss than those who don't. So I know it sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but it's very different. So what I'm saying is that the data to support low glycemic index diets being uniquely efficacious is not there. However, if you tell somebody to eat a low glycemic index diet, they will do better spontaneously than those who don't, and for a handful of reasons. If you have somebody eat a low glycemic index diet, they're going to go out, and if they do it right, they're going to eat a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables, high in fiber, right? And high in fiber is very satiating, okay? And it's likely that they're going to be able to comply with their caloric deficit a lot better than somebody who's not eating a low glycemic index diet. That all being said, at the end of the day, the evidence for glycemic index being uniquely effective is just not there yet, okay? A word now on fiber. Fiber, we've talked about a bunch here. Austin talked about it with relation to his cholesterol lecture. Fiber there was a recent a recent meta-analysis and Cochrane study that was published on the unique effects of fiber on weight loss and death from type 2 diabetes, death from cardiovascular disease, and death from cancer. So when you have a fiber intake that's higher than 29 grams per day for men, 28 grams a day for females, you end up having lower risk of mortality from cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. These are all good things, except for that association only holds if most of that fiber is coming from cereal fiber. Cereal fiber is not just fiber in cereal, it's fiber from whole grains. So that correlation doesn't hold when the fiber is just from fruits and vegetables, which doesn't mean that fruits and vegetables are bad. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the data right now is lacking on fiber content from fruits and vegetables. It's not necessarily there yet. Right? I said that earlier. Nobody gasped or threw anything at me, so I feel like you guys are on my side, understanding that I'm not saying that fruits and vegetables are bad. It's just not something that's evidence-based yet. All right? But again, if you'll think about it, most dietary recommendations probably aren't evidence-based if you get down to brass tacks, right? So if you go out and ask 100 different people how to lose weight, you're going to hear a lot of the same things and stuff that should make you scratch your head and say, well, where the hell does that come from, right? You hear things like eat a big breakfast, right? Eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Something like that, right? Where does that come from? But you'll hear it multiple times. It's just pervaded sort of history. And you'll hear things like eat more fruits and vegetables, which no one will disagree with, but where's the data? You just don't have it yet. So I'm telling you guys to be very cautious when anybody makes a dietary claim that seems, even if it seems feasible, you kind of got to go look at the data. So I'm bearing bad news that fruits and vegetables aren't necessarily the greatest things to ever happen, even though I think there's unique health benefits outside of just weight loss or fiber content. Okay, no one fired at me. It's great. Last thing I'm going to talk about with carbohydrates is going to be high carb versus low carb. Okay, and this is where we'll talk about performance versus health. All right. So typically, when you talk about a performance athlete, most commonly you'll hear they should have a higher carbohydrate diet, particularly if they're anaerobic athletes or if they're endurance athletes, right? High carb, they need carbs to fuel their efforts, all this other stuff, right? So typically you hear this. And then typically for weight loss or health benefits, if the health benefit's going to be coming from weight loss, you hear, they should probably go lower carb, right? That's typically how we see it. Or at least it's how it's perceived in the lay public. Couple issues with this. From a performance standpoint, I would say that there are multiple different outcomes that we're looking for. One, let's say somebody's a physique athlete, so at that point, aesthetic is an issue. Another one is going to be straight up anaerobic performance. So there's going to be weightlifting or short interval stuff, and others going to be aerobic, and then we'll add a fourth one, ultra aerobic. These are super long, like 50 kilometer or ultra marathons. All right. Evidence for higher carb diets being better as far as lean body mass retention during periods of low calorie. That exists. So if you wanted to do the most up-to-date, evidence-based sort of dietary protocol to get as lean as possible while retaining as much muscle mass as possible, it's going to be high protein, moderate carb, low fat. Okay? The evidence shows that for a short period of time, if you do a low carb diet, you won't lose any more muscle mass, but longer term, you see a little bit of loss in lean body mass that's in excess of what we would assume. All right. Some studies will show that low carb diets, you don't lose any more muscle mass. And so the low carb supporters will throw these at you and they'll say, look, see, you can do low carb. The problem is they're comparing it to another diet that's lower in protein. So in order to really assess these diets, they need to be the same in protein, right? Because if you're comparing one diet that has 100 grams of protein in it, 300 grams of carbs, compared to another diet that has 200 grams of protein and 100 grams of carbs, and you're just looking from a lean body mass standpoint, well, wait, one has double the protein, and we would expect the lean body mass to either not change or even be in favor of the low carb diet from that standpoint. So you have to look a little further. So for this, the increased carbs tends to be better.
When you say moderate carbs, I'm sorry.
You good?
Go ahead. When you say moderate carbs, you mean the cereals?
Well, so yeah, it'd be fruits, vegetables, because I have a bias. I can't kill it. Yeah, oatmeal, whole grain, that'd be so that, oats, potatoes, stuff like that, rice. Yep. That being said, I don't know if I can make a good argument for eating clean all the time as long as you're getting your 35 grams of fiber a day. Okay? I want it to be true. I want it to be true. I can sit on my pedestal. I can judge people for eating Pop-Tarts every day. I can't. Not yet. Don't judge me. Hey, man. They're good. Okay, from an anaerobic standpoint, all right, the evidence suggests that for lifting and power performance, that in short term, so usually less than 4 weeks, there's no difference between high carb, low carb. Okay? Oh, good news. Unless you have to diet for longer than that, right? So for an acute weight loss strategy, yep, you could lower carbs. Probably the most interesting thing of these, when you look at what low carb means in the literature, it can mean anything, legitimately anything. Sometimes lower carb refers to a ketogenic diet, 20 grams of carbohydrates a day. Other times it's like 150 grams of carb, which I wouldn't necessarily call low carb. So the definition of the term is not standard across the literature, so there are problems. So overall, the way I interpret that to mean is that you can lower your carbs, you can titrate it to effect, and what I mean by that is you can lower carbs enough to lose weight if that's what you need to do, as long as you do it slowly enough to not compromise anaerobic performance. All right? What they show is that massive weight loss that occurs over a series of 2 weeks, 3 weeks can definitely affect anaerobic performance. And that's like a duh kind of thing, right? Like, yeah, that happens. Okay? Aerobic performance, this is where it starts to get a little stickier. Okay? So right now, the evidence that I have seen suggests that the longer the event gets, the more even these things get. High carb and low carb, even going into ketogenic. And there is some evidence that at ultra marathon type distances, ultra long endurance events, that actual ketogenic diets may outperform a higher carbohydrate diet. The idea is that you get better at metabolizing free fatty acids and fats as a fuel source, and you simultaneously prevent use of muscle glycogen at the same time, which means you don't run out of muscle glycogen and you don't hit that wall. They've shown that this takes anywhere between 3 to 6 months to adapt to that. And I will also admit that this data is very new. It hasn't been repeated a bunch of times. We don't have big sample sizes, although in fairness, nutrition studies in general don't have big sample sizes. So all I'm saying is that from that standpoint, that ketogenic diets may either be equal or outperform either higher carbohydrate diets. You have to assess that data carefully, and my interpretation on it is we don't necessarily know yet, and I don't know if I'd be very confident in saying, yep, everybody who's doing endurance events should do a ketogenic diet. I think that's something you're going to have to play with, but unfortunately, the time it takes to play with that may be too long. If it takes 6 months to see that performance increase, how do you address that directly to the diet versus the training, right? It's not like you didn't train for 6 months, right? And if the sample size is less than 10, right, you don't have a big enough N to say, yep, this works reliably. Okay?
That contradicts the fact that like ultra-marathon runners or even extremely aerobic trained people are using muscle mass or skeletal muscle for energy as opposed to fats. They carry very little muscle and much more fat.
Yeah, and they also store fat in their muscles as well. Yeah. So Yeah, they've done actually like ventilation quotient studies to show that they're actually burning way more fat and less carbohydrates once they've fat adapted, which takes a series of months to do. So it is interesting stuff, I just don't know yet. And so I wouldn't feel comfortable saying or pushing that on people. Similarly, the issue with ketogenic diets, and I'll just say this right now, from an anaerobic standpoint, the data is awful on ketogenic diets. Not necessarily damning, but certainly not supportive and certainly not clear. You have a handful of studies showing, like there's one with elite gymnasts can do the same amount of max pull-ups after 30 days on a ketogenic diet, even though they lost weight. So they lost weight and can do the same amount of pull-ups. It's actually not necessarily good. That being said, again, your sample size is like 7. What do you do with that? I don't know. But I couldn't be on the internet powerfully arguing for a ketogenic diet, improving performance from that standpoint. And certainly it's only 30 days. So what do you do with that? Probably the most compelling data I've seen for ketogenic diet for an anaerobic athlete is that used for a short-term weight control shows no sufficient power or strength drop-off in a week. But that's couched by if your training is on point, right, and you only lose a little bit of body weight in that short time, then was it the diet that uniquely allowed you to maintain your strength output? And if you haven't been on a ketogenic diet before, why would you suddenly switch? Because the idea would be that ketogenic diets do better than other calorie-restricted diets. And that's not necessarily the case unless it improves compliance. Okay, you guys with me? All right. I feel like I didn't beat up on ketogenic diets that hard, and you're welcome, internet. You're welcome. All right. From a health standpoint, it has been said on the internet that low carb or ketogenic diets are healthier than their higher carbohydrate, calorie matched cohort. Right? You guys have heard this? Low carb's healthier, right? Or if you get sick, the first thing you think of, I should probably go low carb. I should probably go low carb. I don't know why. We think it's gonna save us. Okay? On average, people lose about a kilo more within the first 6 weeks when they go low carb, but at 6 months, that advantage disappears, and at 1 year, the advantage is actually in the lower fat group, okay? And even longer term than that, the low fat diet followers tend to do much better, all right?
Would the beginning weight loss be because of water retention?
Yeah, diuresis. So there is some evidence that they lose more fat initially, and the thought is that they're able to do a more aggressive calorie restriction up front than those who follow just a fat-restricted diet. But if you think about somebody coming off a higher carbohydrate, standard American diet who goes to a low carbohydrate diet, think of all the things that they eliminate right off the bat. Perhaps they were eating very hyper-palatable foods that were calorie dense. And now they're like, well, I'm just gonna have lean protein and a bunch of fruits and vegetables and some nuts and nut butters and bacon, right? They adopted this like sort of paleo-esque sort of diet. Well, yeah, you did a more aggressive calorie restriction, and so in addition to the diuresis, you lost a little more weight up front, but it disappears at 6 months and 12 months certainly. Okay? They also the blood pressure tends to be about the same when you look long term, so there's no necessarily advantage outside of just weight loss in general. The cholesterol tends to be a little worse. LDL numbers are a little worse, triglyceride numbers are a little worse, and they get worse as you go in general, the more fat that's in your diet. And so if the fat starts to get, 37% was the cut point where the real risks started to happen for higher fat diets, as far as much greater increase in LDL and triglyceride levels. All right? It's possible to do a low carb, low fat diet. You just have more protein. So that's a high protein, low carb, fat restricted diet. And that tends to work pretty well for weight loss. Why? The energy restriction is high, right? You're at a low calorie deficit. So if you, there was a debate between Gary Taubes and Alan Aragon, and Gary Taubes got on stage and he was talking about low carb diet, insulin hypothesis, and all the stuff that just insulin made you fat and things that bumped up insulin make you fat. Protein also increases insulin very high, just as an aside. And he played a clip where Alan Aragon was talking about getting a guy ready for a bodybuilding show. And he said, yeah, so I just cut his carbohydrates really low. That was like the snippet that he played. And it's like, well, yeah, if you need to lose weight, how are you going to do it? You're not going to cut protein. You're going to cut carbs and or fat, usually both. Duh. Again, that's published in Duh Weekly. Like that was the journal it came from. So I think from a health standpoint, if I had to make recommendations from a carbohydrate standpoint, it would be to eat the appropriate amount of carbs. It wouldn't necessarily be low carb. It may be lower carb than someone's eating currently if their goal is to lose weight. And if their goal is to gain weight, it would be higher carb than what they're eating currently. So that's where either the food journal comes in handy, or if you've calculated the number of calories that they need per day, then you kind of set it at, all right, we're going to start here, see what your weight does, and then adjust up from there. You guys follow? To saturate or unsaturate. As Austin alluded to when talking about cholesterol, people have a different response to eating saturated fat. Some people will tolerate it just fine. Their LDL and triglycerides don't budge, and their HDL goes up, all good. Some people will have a terrible response to saturated fatty acids. All right, so they eat butter, they eat cheese, they eat cream, or they eat something that's high, something else that's high in saturated fats, and their cholesterol numbers get really bad. And I don't think that there's evidence that saturated fat is super beneficial. I don't think it's poison either. All right, so my take on it is, if you're eating a diet that I would agree with, you're going to be eating some saturated fat in your diet, right? You're going to get it from meat, you're going to get it from dairy products, whatever. You're not going out of your way to eat more saturated fat. You're not doing lines of coconut oil, all right? You're not taking a bath in butter, licking the water. That's whatever. Don't do that, okay? That being said, so effectively, I would let the amount of saturated fatty acids enter your diet without adding them, right? It's going to happen naturally. Natural is good, right? Okay. And I don't know of a difference between performance and health on that standpoint, other than you probably shouldn't add saturated fats to your diet. I will say a brief word on coconut oil. Okay, coconut oil is a medium chain triglyceride, it's high in saturated fat. Okay, people will commonly make the claim that, well, you don't store coconut oil as fat because it's medium chain triglyceride, just gets burnt immediately for fuel. It's true. It's true. It's hard to store. Don't do it. Problem is, you don't eat it by itself. You eat it with other stuff. Then instead of burning that, you store that instead. Like, your body, again, is not dumb. If you're not having explosive diarrhea after a meal, you've absorbed that stuff, and it's going to do things, okay? So that's the litmus test. Like, if you're wondering what's the maximum amount of protein that you can absorb in a given meal, right? And then what else happens to the rest of it? You can absorb as much protein as you want to eat, all right, at a given meal. The problem is how much of it is contributing to muscle protein synthesis, how much of it is being oxidized, and the rest of it is going to do other stuff. But again, unless you're having this explosive bowel movement, it's in you, and it's going to do stuff.
Or make a baby.
What's that?
Or make a baby.
Or make a baby. Yeah, maybe you're eating for 2. You don't know. You don't know.
So it's good to have diarrhea. That's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a new weight loss. Yeah, it's a new weight loss. Yeah. If you just get a little giardia, you're fine. You good? Yeah, it's a new diet. Okay, so I recommend that if you're either cooking or you're adding fats to your diet in order to hit a certain macro level, which is one of the ways that I like to counsel people on nutrition, one effective way, is that you have as many monounsaturated fatty acids and some polyunsaturated fatty acids. So polyunsaturated fatty acids, we'll start there. Those are omega-3s, 6s, and 9s. You're going to get them from fish. Okay, you're going to get them also in dairy, other meats. This is where that sort of benefit of grass-fed meat would theoretically come in handy, because they have longer chain polyunsaturated fatty acids compared to like a oil source or whatever. That being said, the data on do people who eat grass-fed products only do better than those who don't, that doesn't exist. So in any event, if I had to make a bias, it would be that your polyunsaturated fatty acids would come from good sources of meat, and fish, and dairy. So that's your PUFAs. Your MUFAs, monounsaturated fatty acids, those would come from things like olive oil, peanut butter, nuts, tree nuts, and nut butters, avocado, stuff like that. Okay, so if you had to add fat, those would be my added fats, all right?